Yo, 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 what's going on? It's your boy Antron420. So, before I begin this explanation video, I just want to make a really big disclaimer. This mod is not for the faint of heart. It was ridiculously difficult. Um, unless you're extremely confident with a soldering iron and a Dremel tool and things like that, I do not recommend trying this. Uh, Mainly because the little LCD inside the DR-202, the ribbon cable attached to it is absolutely paper thin. It's criminal how thin it is, and you have to be extremely careful. That being said, let's crack into it. So, I found this video on YouTube a little while back. I think it's about like 5 years old, where this guy put a backlight into a Boss DR-202, and there's like a number, maybe like a dozen comments on there, and all of the comments are people complaining that he didn't make a tutorial about how to do this. And now, after doing it myself, I totally see why he didn't make a tutorial, because it was really a pain in the ass. Um, anyway, here it is. It looks great. It looks really awesome. Um, so I basically documented the whole thing, more or less, and I'm going to try my best to explain it. In the comments of that video, this guy says all he did was he just pulled the backlight out of an existing 16 by 2 LCD screen, and he just put it in the DR-202, and he stresses it is of the utmost importance that you do not damage the LCD screen that is inside the Dr. Groove, because it's not an off-the-shelf thing. You can't just replace it if it breaks. So keep that in mind. Yeah. So the first thing I did is I removed the backlight from the LCD. I picked this one up from my local electronics store. They're probably cheaper on eBay and stuff, but this one was only $10, and I figured it would be pretty good quality. The store is called Tinkersphere, so I just went on here and I searched 16 by 2, and this screen came up. I chose to use a green one because it's closest to the original color of the LCD. This is the now naked computer board from the LCD module, which took the screen out of its housing. If you look over here on the side, these little connectors labeled A and K, that's the anode and cathode of the backlight itself, or well, of the whole screen itself. So the first thing I did is I took the little chassis off that was holding everything together. There's just these little pins on the bottom, and I took a pair of needle nose pliers and bent the pins so that I could pop the whole thing off, making sure that I didn't damage the screen as I did that. And I just took all the extra parts and set them aside because those are going to be used later. I noticed that once I had the backlight exposed, that it was adhered to the back of the PCB. So I just used the blunt end of the dull side of my mat knife and just unstuck the little adhesive there and tilted the backlight forward a little bit. And then I just gently heated up the leads on it until they broke free of their computer board prison. Now, one thing that I noticed while I was taking this apart is that there's this little resistor in line right here with the anode of the LCD. So I was like, what the heck's going on with that? And I added my own little 100 ohm resistor to the anode, making absolutely sure that it was actually the positive side that I'm connecting it to. And then I moved on to my 202. I removed the knobs. You just got to kind of pull straight up on them very gently. The potentiometers that are holding them on are also they also have plastic components, so you got to be really careful not to break those. So I just pulled off these 8 buttons on top, and then also this big orange one. Took a little extra oomph to get the orange one off, but just be gentle. Um, Now after that, you flip it over. On the back side, you have 7 Phillips head screws. There are no screws in the battery housing, so that's pretty cool. So I just took those Phillips head screws out, um, put them in a little cup so I didn't lose any of them. And then the back side of the unit just comes right off. There's nothing attached to the back side. It just comes off. Um, it starts to get tricky once the back comes off, because you think that the motherboard is just going to be exposed there, but it isn't. There is this weird copper shielding that has a sort of a plastic film on the other side. It's like a protective anti-static shielding. So the first thing you'll notice is if you're trying to take the motherboard off, there's these 4 screws on the bottom side holding it on. And then after you remove those screws, this copper film thingy uh, is soldered on the bottom left corner. So in order to get the motherboard out, I had to heat up that little uh, pad, and while gently lifting with a pair of tweezers until it just popped right up. And of course, the whole time I was doing this, I was being extra careful not to touch the soldering iron to any of the components or to the plastic housing. So anyway, that's disconnected. And before you just go ripping the motherboard straight out, um, you got to be very careful because this is where the ribbon cables come in. So what I did is on the right hand side of of the motherboard, I just gently lifted it up and peeked inside to see where my ribbon cables were connected. And of course, so there's 3 of them, and the LCD one is the shortest one. So you got to be really careful not to overextend that. Just don't try to remove the connectors from the board. The ribbon cables are friction fit in there. So I took those out, and then when I got to the LCD one, there's like at the very end, right where it connects, there's a little uh, thicker, kind of sturdier part. Um, I just use my hands. I'm sure that probably isn't the best method, but I just very gently and carefully, every step of the way, pulled it out of its housing. Just carefully removed the motherboard from its plastic housing so that I could check it out. I thought this was going to be extremely easy, but this is where it got really hard. So the little plastic panel on the front here is actually exposed a little bit here and here on either side of the LCD on the inside of the front panel. Um, so I just tried pushing that with my fingers and it would not move at all. It is glued in there super well. I pushed and pushed, try not to be too forceful with it, and it wouldn't come out. So I ended up having to use a heat gun, which was really not fun. I was afraid I was going to be destroying it the entire way through. So I just put the heat gun on low and gently applied heat until eventually I could pop the thing off from the inside with my fingers, all the while being very careful not to ruin this LCD screen. And then from there, I basically did the same thing that I would do if I was modding a Game Boy, which I've done a ton of Game Boy backlight mods. Um, the LCD is sitting in the front. Once this plastic panel is off, it's just resting in its little housing, and you can take it out. It has a little bit of glue holding it in, but it's not much. Um, and on the back side of the LCD is a sort of foil film, and I just used my mat knife to very carefully lift the corner of that film up, and then I pulled it off the rest of the way with my fingers. There is actually a polarizer that is permanently stuck onto the LCD, and you don't want to remove that. It's absolutely necessary. Otherwise, the characters on the screen will not be visible to the human eye. Next, the hardest part, I had to make room for the backlight. The thing is, the backlight is larger than this housing that the LCD rests on, so I thought it would look weird if the light was being blocked from coming through on the corners. So this is where I got destructive. I took out the Dremel tool and very carefully the I cut the top corners off so that they were flush with the edges of the little window for the screen, and also I protected the parts that I didn't want to get damaged with masking tape. Um, and yeah, this is the Dremel bit that I used. It looks like a Q-tip that's made of sandpaper. So I removed those little wing thingies from the top, and then the bottom ones I did not remove entirely. I just shaved off the top, maybe like half a centimeter of it, just so it was exactly the correct size for the backlight to fit in. And then on the backside of the housing, I carved into the edge of it a little bit on the left side where the backlight sort of sticks out. That's where the connecting pins are for the power. Of course, I tested this thing out before I just went and chucked it in. You got to make sure it works. So it took me a minute to realize what it is that I needed to do. When I did Game Boy mods, there's this huge capacitor right next to the screen that a lot of people like to use to tap power from because it's flawless. So I figured, if I can do that with the Game Boy, I could probably do that with this thing. So I looked at the power switch on the top of the unit, and I followed the leads on the back side until I realized that there are these two giant capacitors that are connected to the power switch. Accessing the capacitors is really difficult. You have to actually partially remove this protective copper layer from the top of the motherboard. It's covering up all the soldering points where all the components are connected to the board. I disconnected these three pads here, here, and here, and I used the same method as I did when I was disconnecting the grounding pad when I first opened the unit. Just very gently lifted with tweezers as I heated the soldering point up until it came loose. Then I did what no one should ever do, and I wadded up a bunch of toilet paper and stuffed it in there to hold the copper up while I connected my wires. It was pretty much smooth sailing from there. I just connected my wires to the capacitor nearest to the power switch, negative and positive respectively, and I ran it across the board to the edge, taped it down with some Kaplan tape, and then wrapped it around to the other side of the motherboard where the wires would be sandwiched between the two PCBs. You don't really have to worry too much. There's plenty of space in the case. I just went straight from point A to point B to the backlight, where I then connected my wires. And after that was the next tricky part. If you recall earlier, I said to put those components from the original LCD off to the side. What I did was I used the original glass panel that came in the housing of the LCD. It has a polarizer attached to it, so it's kind of uh, shaded green. And after I set everything back in place, I adhered this glass to the little plastic housing using some E6000. I decided E6000 was a better choice than super glue because it could be removed if I totally screwed this up. Um, so basically, this glass panel, it's just holding the backlight in place. The LCD is resting on top, and the ribbon cable still has space to come through on the other side, just as it originally did. If you recall earlier, I had taken those little wings off that were holding the LCD in place, so I needed something else to hold everything in place. I'm pretty sure there are a number of different ways that you could go about holding these things in place, but I'm pretty confident about the integrity of my design here. And I don't think it's going to be going anywhere. It's been 24 hours, and so far, so good. um, so, basically, after that comes the very annoying part. You have to put all those pads connecting the copper thingy um, back together. I added a little extra solder while I was doing it. If you heat up the copper too much, the plastic on the other side melts, so that's not recommended. Um, and after those pads were all connected, I plugged in all my ribbon cables. Um, at this point, the LCD is still kind of dangling out the front, which is really not great. And I screwed the motherboard back in place with everything situated properly. LCD hanging out the front. I reconnected my grounding pad there after the screws were all in, and closed the unit up. Um, and then back to the front, I put the LCD in there. I had cleaned it off with 99% isopropyl alcohol. Make sure there isn't a single blemish on it. You got to make sure that the plastic cover for the screen also doesn't have any debris on the opposite side, so that everything stays nice and tidy and clean. Um, and then I just plopped that LCD in there, right where it belongs, and covered it back up with the plastic cover. Um, I didn't want to heat it up again to get it to stick better, but I mean, it's on there. It's not coming off. So I'm really kind of scared of heat guns. um, so yeah, this capacitor power connection is good because you get both the power from your 9-volt DC and the power from the batteries, depending on which one you want to use. Before I buttoned it back up, I tested it out, did my DC power, then I unplugged that, I put batteries in it, it worked both ways, um, everything was good, and then I proceeded to put the screws back in the back. I think I covered everything. And I hope that I provided more answers than questions. I'll leave links to the original YouTube video and the screen that I purchased from Tinkersphere in the description. And if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. Yeah. Thanks a lot.